He said it between bites of French toast, like it was nothing. Like telling me the weather had turned, or that we were low on coffee again. "We've been thinking, Mom." My son-in-law set down his fork and looked at me across the kitchen table. My kitchen table, the one Jean refinished by hand the winter before the doctors found anything wrong with him. "You're not getting any younger. And honestly, this property is a lot. The maintenance alone." He let the sentence trail off. Didn't finish it, just raised an eyebrow and reached for his orange juice. I was holding a dish towel. I don't know why I remember that detail, but I do. It had little blue anchors printed on it. I'd had it for 11 years. I stood very still. "What kind of thinking?" I asked. My daughter was at the counter, rinsing something that didn't need rinsing. I recognized the motion. She'd done it as a teenager, when she didn't want to be part of a conversation, but didn't want to leave the room either. "We looked at a few places," my son-in-law said, his voice careful and kind in the practiced way that certain men are careful and kind when they want you to agree with something. "Down in Grover Hills, independent living, really lovely actually, walking trails. They do movie nights." I set the dish towel on the counter, smoothed it flat, kept my voice even. "In this place?" He cleared his throat. "We'd figure it out, obviously." Obviously. I nodded slowly, the way I'd learned to nod over 64 years of being a woman who knew how to take a blow without showing it. "I'll think about it," I said. And I walked outside. The property sits on 11 acres outside Harmon Falls, Virginia. Jean and I found it in 1989, when it was nothing but overgrown pasture and a creek that flooded every March. We were 38 years old, kids with big ideas and a joint savings account that barely covered the land. We camped out here the first 2 summers while we cleared it ourselves. I mixed concrete for the foundation posts in a wheelbarrow I bought secondhand. Jean built the wraparound porch in sections, one paycheck at a time over 3 years. We raised my daughter here. She grew up running barefoot to the creek, sleeping under a ceiling. Jean painted with her favorite constellations: Orion, Cassiopeia, the Pleiades. He spent 4 weekends on it. Said a kid should fall asleep looking at something bigger than herself. When Jean died, 6 years ago now, I kept the property running. Just me. A woman alone on 11 acres is what some people call stubborn. I call it honoring something that deserved to be honored. My daughter and my son-in-law moved in 18 months ago. They'd hit a rough patch, they said. The catering company he'd been running went under in the spring, and they needed to regroup. Of course. Family helps family. I had the space. I didn't think twice. I should have thought once. I went back inside after he'd left for whatever meeting he had that morning, and my daughter had taken the car into town. I stood in the hallway, the long one that runs from the front door, past the study, past the room that was my daughter's, all the way to the back mudroom where Jean's fishing gear still hangs on the hooks. There's a cabinet in the study. Old oak, a little warped at the bottom from a year the flooding was worse than usual. Inside, I keep the things that matter. Property deed in Jean's handwriting, updated after he passed. The original building permits, our marriage certificate, and a plain manila folder I hadn't opened in some time. I opened it now. It was all there. The records I'd kept the way my mother kept records. Not on a computer, not in an app, just in handwriting on paper, because paper doesn't crash and paper doesn't lie. The semester I co-signed my daughter's first apartment lease, because her credit wasn't established. The car loan I covered when she got laid off from the marketing job, $6,200, paid in full, never mentioned again. The emergency I got the call about, at 2 a.m, the one involving my son-in-law's business partner, and a dispute that required a lawyer, and I wrote a check for $9,500 because my daughter was crying, and he was too proud to cry and someone had to fix it. I had forgotten some of these. Not forgotten. I'd tucked them away the way mothers tuck things away, because the act of giving was never supposed to be a ledger. You help your child. You don't keep score. But standing in that study, in that house, Jean built, looking at the handwriting on those pages, I felt something click into focus that had been blurry for months. This wasn't about maintenance. It wasn't about walking trails in Grover Hills. I had been moved from person to plan. I might not have pushed further if it weren't. For what I found, 2 days later, left open on the kitchen counter because my son-in-law had rushed out of the house in a hurry and hadn't thought to close his laptop. I wasn't snooping. I was wiping down the counter. The screen was right there. It was an email thread. Subject line: Harmon Falls Acreage, Development Feasibility. His name in the to field. A firm called Blackridge Properties in the from. The most recent message was dated 4 days ago, the same week he'd sat across from me with his orange juice and his careful voice. I didn't read the whole thread. I read enough. They'd been in contact since September. I closed the laptop, finished wiping down the counter, and went to sit in the chair on the back porch. The old rocking chair Jean built from a kit in the first year, the one with the arms worn smooth from decades of hands. I sat there for a long time and looked out at the creek, still running cold this late in the season, glinting between the bare willows. Jean would have said something wry and quiet, and exactly right. I didn't have him for that anymore. What I had was a phone and a friend. Maxine had been a real estate attorney for 31 years. We met at church back when my daughter was in middle school, bonded over a terrible potluck casserole and a shared sense of humor about it, and had been close ever since. She'd helped Jean and me update our property documents after he passed. She didn't push and she didn't pry. She just worked. I called her from the back porch. She picked up on the second ring. "I need your help," I said, "with the property." A pause. "What kind of help?" "The kind where I want to make sure I'm doing things right, quietly." She didn't ask a lot of questions. She asked the right ones. When I was done, she said, "Come in Thursday, bring the deed and whatever estate documents you have. We'll look at where you stand." Where I stood, as it turned out, was exactly where I'd always stood. On my own land, with my own name on the title, with full legal authority to do exactly as I chose with it. My son-in-law's name appeared nowhere on anything, not because of any foresight on my part. Just because it had never come up. Nobody had ever thought to ask, and he had never thought to check. I put the property on the market on a Tuesday. No sign at the end of the drive. No listing on a public site. Maxine handled everything through a private network she'd worked with for years. Buyers who were serious, who didn't need to be coddled, who understood they were looking at when they saw it. The couple came on a Thursday morning. My daughter was at a yoga class she'd taken to going to in town. My son-in-law was at his desk in the study, the same study where Jean's filing cabinet stands, on what he called a strategy call, headphones on. I served coffee in the front sitting room and kept my voice low, and the conversation to the things that mattered. The couple was in their early 50s. She had the look of someone who'd spent years making a house a home for other people, and was finally ready to do it for herself. He asked about the creek flooding, about the well, about the soil near the south end of the property where I'd once tried to grow tomatoes. He said we'd want to plant an orchard there eventually. I told him the soil was good, deep, dark, patient. It would hold whatever you gave it. We sat for nearly 2 hours. At one point, my son-in-law came through looking for more coffee, glanced in through the doorway. I introduced the couple as old friends of a friend passing through the area. He nodded, poured his coffee, and went back down the hall. The couple made an offer the following morning, full asking price. I signed the papers in Maxine's office on a Friday afternoon, while my son-in-law was in Raleigh for what he'd called a networking trip. Maxine slid the final page across the desk and handed me the pen. I didn't pause. Quick cuts, not slow ones. When I left her office, the air outside smelled like wood smoke from someone's chimney down the block. I drove home, walked through the house one last time, room by room, and started putting things in boxes. I'd made arrangements for a small rental cabin near the state park, about 20 minutes from where I'd always been. The woman who owned it said it was quiet. Quiet sounded like exactly what I needed. I packed the way you pack when you finally understand what matters. Jean's books, in the order he kept them. The quilt his mother made that hung on the guest room wall. My recipe box, wood-worn soft at the corners, every card in my mother's handwriting or mine. My daughter's baby pictures. One photograph of Jean standing in front of the porch frame, not yet finished, grinning like a man who knew exactly what he was building. On Saturday at 12:17 p.m., my son-in-law called. I didn't answer. At 12:19 again. At 12:24, a text. Call me right now. There's some kind of mistake with the property records. At 12:31, this isn't funny. We need to talk immediately. At 12:38, my daughter. Mom, where are you? Lance says something happened with the house. At 12:45, Mom, please, what did you do? I read every message. I set the phone face down on the seat beside me and finished the drive to the cabin. That evening, I opened a bottle of Riesling I'd been holding on to since the year Jean and I took a trip to the Shenandoah Valley that was supposed to be a proper second honeymoon and turned into a wonderful accident of wrong turns and better-than-expected roadside restaurants. I poured a glass, sat at the small table by the window. The trees outside were the particular dark of early evening, just before full night. I thought about my son-in-law's email thread. September. He'd been talking to that development company since September, and in October, he'd sat across from me and talked about movie nights. I raised my glass and said nothing out loud. But I felt it, something heavy setting down, something that had been sitting on my sternum for months, maybe years, finally lifting. My daughter called 17 times over 2 days. I let her leave messages. I listened to each one. The first few were confused, then urgent, then something closer to frightened. Not for me, I noticed, but about the situation, about what it meant, about what came next. On the third day, she texted, "Can I see you? Just me, please." I texted back an address and a time. She came alone. She looked the way people look when they haven't slept and have been rehearsing a conversation long enough that the conversation no longer makes sense. She stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked around at the small kitchen, the low ceilings, the window that framed a stand of cedar trees. I made tea, we sat. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "You didn't warn us." "No," I agreed. "We had plans." She stopped. "I know about his plans," I said quietly. "Blackridge Properties, the email thread, September." She blinked, once then looked at the table. "How long did you know?" I asked. "I didn't know everything," she said, "and I believed part of that." "Did you know some things?" She didn't answer, which was an answer. I wrapped both hands around my mug. "I built that property with your father," I said. 11 acres, 2 of us, 30-some years. The concrete for the foundation posts, I mixed that in a second-hand wheelbarrow. Your bedroom ceiling, the one with the constellations, your father spent 4 weekends on that ceiling, for you. She had tears in her eyes. I kept mine steady. I co-signed your first apartment when you had no credit. I paid the lawyer when Lance had his business dispute. $9,500, in case you didn't know the number. I never asked to be repaid. I never needed to. That's not what a mother does. But you were sitting there across from me at your father's table, talking about movie nights in Grover Hills, while your husband was already in contact with a development company about my land. Mom, I'm not angry, I said. And I meant it. I'm not even hurt, not the way I was at the beginning. I'm clear, there's a difference. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She'd done it the same way as a child. I didn't know he'd gone that far, she said finally. I believe you. A long silence. Where does that leave us? She asked. Right here, I said, having tea, talking honestly, which is more than we were doing before. She stayed for 2 hours. She didn't ask about the sale money. She didn't ask about my plans. She asked, eventually, quietly, like someone trying a door they weren't sure would open, whether I was okay. It was the first time she'd asked that in a very long time. I told her I was more than okay. I told her I was starting to remember what okay felt like when it was real. The cabin was temporary, but it was mine in a way the big house hadn't been for months. I moved through it without apologizing for the space I took up. I made coffee in the morning without checking whether someone else wanted it first. I read in the evenings with the lamp turned up as high as I liked. Maxine called to confirm the transfer was fully recorded. The buyers had taken possession and were already making arrangements to move before winter. Good people in a good place. That was what the property deserved. Not a development company, not a firm called Blackridge with clipboards and profit projections. 2 people who asked about the soil and wanted to plant an orchard. My granddaughter came to visit on a Saturday near the end of October. She's 11, and she has her grandfather's eyes, that particular shade of gray-green that always looked like a weather change coming. She came in and immediately climbed onto the small sofa and pulled a blanket over herself like she'd always lived there. "Grandma," she said, "why is your house so small now?" "It's the right size," I said. "I only need room for what matters." She thought about this with the seriousness that 11-year-olds bring to things adults have stopped taking seriously. "Dad's been really mad." "I know. He keeps saying you did something sneaky." I carried 2 mugs of hot chocolate to the sofa and sat beside her. "What do you think?" She considered this for a moment, head tilted, completely serious. "I think grown-ups call things sneaky when they didn't think of it first." I laughed, a real one from the chest. She grinned at me, gap-toothed on the left side, exactly the way her mother was at that age. We stayed on the sofa and watched the cedar trees move in the wind outside the window. She told me about a book she was reading, about a woman who crossed the country alone in a covered wagon and kept going even when the road disappeared. She said the woman in the book was the bravest person she'd ever read about. She had to keep going even when it was hard, my granddaughter said. "The best ones always do," I told her. Before she left, she hugged me for a long time around the middle, both arms, face pressed to my shoulder. The way she used to when she was small, I held on. At the door, she turned back. "Grandma, Dad said you sold the house while he was in Raleigh." "I did." She nodded, slow and certain, like someone arriving at an answer they'd been working toward all afternoon. "Good." My son-in-law called once, about 3 weeks later. I picked up because I believe in not hiding. He wanted to know how I could do something like that without consulting anyone. He used the word blindsided. He said I had put them in a very difficult position. I let him finish. Then I said, "I consulted myself. That was the right person to consult." He said something about how family handles things together. I said, "In September, while you were sitting at my dinner table, you were emailing a development company about my property." I saw the thread. "I'd like you to think carefully about what together means before you use the word again." He was quiet. "That property was mine," I said. "Legally. Completely. With no question. I made a decision about my own land. You were planning to make a decision about my land too. The difference is, I actually had the right to." Another silence, longer this time. "I don't hate you," I said. "I want to be clear about that. You made choices that were not made for my benefit, and I made one that was. That's the whole story." He said he needed time. I said, "Take all you need." My daughter calls now, not every day, but steadily. The calls have changed in quality, less rehearsed, more herself. She asked me last week if I would come to her house for Thanksgiving. I told her I would consider it, but that I needed her to do something first, just once, without prompting. Look her husband in the eye and tell him that what he was planning in September was wrong. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I already did last week." I believed her. "Then yes," I said, "I'll come." There's a desk in the cabin near the window. Not Jean's desk that I left behind, but a small one I found at an estate sale in town, wood the color of old honey, a little wobbly on the left leg. I put a book under it. Works fine now. I sit there in the mornings with my coffee and I write. Not anything anyone will read. Just the things that needed saying after years of being said to no one. Yesterday, I wrote about the first summer Jean and I camped on the property. How we cooked over a fire and argued about where to put the kitchen window, and he said, "You always know exactly how the light should fall." And I thought he was teasing, but he wasn't. He meant it as a fact. The way he meant everything, fully and without irony, right up to the end. He was right. I do know how the light should fall. I'm just finally living in it again. There's a narrow meadow behind the cabin that catches the afternoon sun in a way that reminds me of something I can't quite name. A feeling more than a place. Last week, I put on my boots and walked out to the middle of it and just stood there. Cold November air, the smell of pine and cut grass, a hawk making slow circles overhead with no particular urgency. I stayed until my cheeks were stiff from the cold. I walked back in, made a fresh pot of coffee, and sat at the honey-colored desk. Outside, the hawk was still there when I looked up, still circling, still in no hurry. Some things don't need to be rushed. Some things just need room to move. That's what I have now. Room. And the quiet that comes when you stop making yourself small enough to fit inside someone else's plans and start remembering the size of your own.